Thank you. Morning, everybody. Yeah. So, who am I? Who's this bloke? Yes, Alan Millband, not Millband, please. I'm a health and safety lawyer. I am a partner at one of the largest regional law firms, Shakespeare's. It'd be funny if they had an office in Stratford upon Avon, wouldn't it? Yes, we have. And I'm a health and safety lawyer for my sins. I head up a team where we do plenty of health, safety and environmental law. And I have advised, assisted and represented numerous organisations in this sector over the years. So I have a long association with extractive quarrying industries. Hugh preceded me with a very informative presentation. And quite rightly, Hugh is very, very proud to be associated with a great deal of a great number of impressive customers. And they're obviously happy to be associated with him because they're happy for him to refer to them and use the names. My clients, on the other hand, would rather that you didn't know who they were. Because generally speaking, they bring me in when something's gone horribly wrong. And a while back, I asked the compliance director of a very large national that would be a familiar name to you, if I could actually use the name of his organisation in promotional material and the like. And he told me to sugar off. At least I think that's what he said. I had an ear infection at the time. But the long and short of it is I represent a lot of organisations and in this sector who unfortunately have fallen foul of Richard Roy and their colleagues, and who find themselves not only in a great deal of trouble, but find themselves quite frequently in court. And I regret to say that I'm seeing the same mistakes happen over and over again that leads to that end game. And we thought it would be useful to share that with you. Now, hopefully, you will all sit here and think, oh, this is good. We're not doing any of that. We're not getting these things wrong. But I'll share the experience with you anyway, and we can take it from there. My experience is that these things are going wrong because you keep getting them wrong. The same mistakes are being made over and over again. And I've included that as a quotation because I think it's very important here. Smart people learn from their mistakes, but the real sharp ones learn from the mistakes of others. So hopefully you'll learn from some of this sharing today. The quotation is from something called Fablehaven by Brandon Mull, and I've no idea who he is or where the quote really comes from. Yeah, good though, isn't it? Right, okay, here we go. So what are we getting wrong? We're mismanaging contractors. We're doing waste of time audits. We're taking risk for granted. And despite Roy's encouraging remarks, in my experience, there's still too much incompetence going on. Then there's this rather curiously phrased, you don't know what you're doing, so you don't know what we're doing. That's about the detachment of senior management. That's about directors and senior officers not getting their responsibilities right. Is that all? No. I could share experiences with you about, in this sector, we are still not always identifying hazards as significant. We're not always engaging sufficiently with employees in the risk assessment process. It's not an exhaustive list, but these are the particular mistakes that I want to share with you. In the materials that you've got before you, the wrong regulations are quoted, so you might just want to quickly change the Regulation 3 and the Regulation 29 for 11 and 39. I'm sorry about that. That's a mistake on my part. I must learn not to keep repeating the mistake of not proofreading slides sufficiently. Contractor management and the law. Management of health and safety at work regulations, right? Those who share a workplace are required to cooperate with each other, right? In order to make sure that the work can be carried out safely by those who do it and those who might be affected by it. And they're also required to coordinate their efforts so that the control measures that are in place to manage risk are coordinated between the two and don't cut across each other or fall foul of each other. So there's a requirement of cooperation and coordination. And you should all be aware, I'm sure you are, Regulation 39. It is the responsibility of every employer of anyone at work at a quarry to make sure that there is cooperation with the operator so that the task can be carried out safely. So one of the things I'm afraid that is happening is there is an absence of cooperation and coordination. We get into the habit of dealing with the same contractors over and over again. We begin to take things for granted. Because of that, we are receiving documents which look right. We're receiving methodology that appears on the face of it to be okay, and we go along with it. Do we scrutinise it? Not necessarily. Do we engage in appropriate dialogue? Now, obviously, this isn't necessarily across the board, and it's not necessarily in the jobs that we carry out that require extensive planning and extensive care. Sometimes it's at the smaller end jobs. But I'm afraid that one of the things that we're still falling foul of is insufficiency of cooperation and coordination. So be mindful of that. Then there's the subject of expertise. I'm getting clients over and over again who believe that because they have not got the expertise to have a particular activity carried out, they can rely entirely on the contractor to do the task safely if that contractor appears on the face of it to have the appropriate expertise. But what I'm seeing is that people are sometimes using contractors not because they don't have the expertise, but because it's more cost efficient to use the contractors, but then still trying to fall back on the broad excuse that they are the experts, so we expect them to do the job properly. Well, if you have the expertise, it's no good trying to defer to the contractor's expertise. You're expected to know as much as he does. If you don't, it still does not excuse you from avoiding scrutiny of the methodology and checking that the proposed methods of work are correct. And I'm afraid to say that time and time again, I'm seeing expertise of contractors used as an excuse for not looking closely enough, not only at what they do, but how they propose to do it in the first place. So please watch out for that. Documentation, I've referred to this briefly. We get into routine for certain matters. We see the same documentation over and over again. We presume it to be correct. It gets old. It's not as specific as it should be. It doesn't account for changes. We get comfortable with it and we assume that it's going to work well because it worked well last time. You can't do that. You've got to have an eye to the documentation, and you are expected to know about the important hazards, the significant risks, and you are expected to ask, is what I'm seeing in the proposed methodology going to address those particular hazards and risks? So people are getting sloppy with the documentation put forward by contractors. Changing methodology. I'm also seeing this a lot. There is good cooperation and coordination between an organisation and a contractor. Good documentation is provided. Method statements, safe systems of work written, assessments, risk assessments. Everything is all nicely packaged, and then the contractor arrives at the site and it can't be done that way. Not necessarily a fundamental change, but some change has to be made. And at that point, the whole thing goes wrong. Because no one takes a step back and says, we've got to revisit the working methods now because we can't do it in the same way that we envisaged. So I'm afraid, sorry about this, but you have to be able to rely on people to react properly to shifting methodology, to changes in the proposed method. You've got to be able to do that. And you've got to know that the people who are having the interface with the contractors are able to say, well, hold on a minute, if you're now proposing to do that, we all need to take a step backward. We all need to pause for a bit of thought, and we need to discuss what needs amendment in the proposed working methods so that everyone can still continue to do it safely. So, sorry, that is a feature that is cropping up time and time again. Waste of time audits. I suspect that all your organisations are carrying out far-reaching and robust audits. And it's great if you are, and I'm sure you're finding things out and getting things put right. I'm sure through that procedure you are finding out ways in which systems and procedures can be improved. And that's great. But it's not borne out by my experience all across this sector or others, I'm afraid. I've used a rather flippant couple of lines there. Why did the auditor cross the road? Because that's what he did on his last audit. Think about it for a moment and ask, is my auditing system now getting rather predictable? Am I doing it in the same way? Am I simply asking the same questions over and over again? And am I preparing, therefore, the chap that I'm talking to respond well to that audit on the day, but without necessarily any investigation of what he might be responding to and in what way on other occasions? And equally, in doing it in the same way over and over again, am I making it comfy and cosy? Am I losing the real engagement that I need when I'm having something audited? It is a problem, I'm afraid, that too many audits are rather cosy and based on dialogue rather than actually trying to get to the grips of the issues. And the nature of the audit, if you can't do everything across the board in your regular audits, then you have to focus on particular things. And yes, you should focus on the high risk areas first, because those are the ones you want to know where your systems and procedures, your health and safety arrangements are working properly. And in my experience, audits are getting rather friendly. The auditor, certainly internal auditor, goes in and sees a chap that he knows. Neither of them wants to fall out too much with each other. So for example, he might be saying, now, over the areas where they need to happen, are you following closely the permit to work procedures? Yes. Have you got your permits folder? Yes. Can I see it? Yes, here it is. Good, you're doing them. Put that thought to one side for a moment. I am told that historically, the people in banks used to quiver and shake when the auditors came round. And that's because the auditors were very, very difficult to deal with, asked very, very difficult questions, forensically searched through lots of materials, made life uncomfortable. But they were respected. And rather than have to go through the process of having the robust audit and then accounting for things going wrong, it was better to try and get it right in the first place. I've just realised that perhaps in the light of recent history, that was probably the worst example I could have come up with. So I'll try and think of a new one for Chesterfield. Detective works elementary. Go back to that permit to work example. Internal auditor writes up report. Yes, permit to work, procedures being followed, seen the folder, forms completed, looks good. Something goes horribly wrong in an area where a permit to work is required. I can vouch that Richard, Roy and their colleagues will only need about 15 minutes with the relevant employees to do a fairly good calculation of how many entries into the area were required under the permit to work. And they will then look at how many permit to work documents they've got. And in no time at all, forensically, they'll say you are only using the permit to work documents in 35% of these cases. They will do it as easy as that, and yet your internal auditor hasn't picked it up. So think about that. It's no point in going about an audit in what I would term a touchy-feely way. It ain't going to achieve anything. So ask yourself, are the audits that I'm doing properly rooting things out? Because let's face it, we want to know where it's going wrong, because then we can head it off. And then, love them though we do, you don't get Richard, Roy and their colleagues coming in to investigate you, and you don't need to engage people like me, which has got to be good, hasn't it? Okay? Taking risk for granted. Let's have a reminder about the general law on risk assessment. Well, we're meant to carry out risk assessments. And most of us know that. And if we employ 5 or more people, we're meant to write them down. Yeah? And if any of you are operating quarries that employ fewer than 5 people, I'm sure that's most of you, then basically still write them down. It's quite a good idea. And in some cases you're required to anyway. So we all know about Regulation 3, but a lot of us have forgotten about Regulation 4. The principles of prevention. This is how we are meant to address risk. And in Schedule 1, it tells us what principles we're meant to follow. Okay, anyone brave enough to answer the question, please? Sorry, I know I'm meant to do the talking, but I was promised I was going to be presenting to a bright and intelligent lot. And when they arrive, there's still some seats. Yeah. So, what's the first? What's the first on the list of principles of prevention? Go on, shout it out. You know the answer. Avoid. Avoid is the first one, but experience shows we're actually in the mindset that we'll carry all risk, but we'll have good control measures in to deal with it. That's not how we do it. Right? First of all, if we can avoid the risk, then we have to avoid it. Yes, we are looking at reasonable practicability, but again, you could have got me on the subject of reasonable practicability and a tendency out here to think if something's going to put us to a bit of nuisance or trouble, we can claim it's not reasonably practicable to do it, and that's not what the reasonably practicable test is about. What you're doing in the reasonable practicable test is on the one hand you're balancing the risk with, on the other, the cost in terms of money, time, resource of eliminating it or properly managing it. So I'm afraid we're in the mindset of carrying risk. Work at height regulations. Avoid it. If you can avoid work at height, then you must. Okay? And yet somehow the mindset that not you, I'm sure, but my clients are getting into is, right, well, we can do work at height as long as we plan it, and as long as we've got all the assessments in place, and we make sure that everybody's going to be all right if there's a fall. It's not like that. The starting point is, can you get rid of it? And often the answer, not necessarily in this sector, but often the answer is, yeah, we can. And so that's what you've got to do. What else is there in the... If we can't avoid it, what else there is in the principles of prevention are things like, we then evaluate, we combat at source. You know all of this, we adapt the work. What we also have to do, and this is significant because of what you'll hear later, particularly from Peter, is we've got to adapt to technical progress. We've got to be mindful of how technology and technical matters are advancing in what we do and take those on board. It's in the principles of prevention. And I'm afraid to say that, yeah, the worrying trend is towards carrying risk. And when did you last review the risk assessments, health and safety document, the fundamentals in that, and all of the other things that require review, not least because Regulation 11 tells us that. Regulation 11 requires an operator to ensure that the measures are reviewed on a regular basis or when circumstances demand that they do. So again, I'm afraid I am seeing too many instances of clients before me who are saying, well, we got all the systems and procedures in place, but they've begun from taking it for granted that it's a risk that they can and should carry. So please watch for that. Incompetence. Rather worryingly, one of my assistants came to me not too long ago because she had to provide some advice in a matter and said, can you help me with this? You're good at incompetence. I'm still working on that one. Competence and capability, the legal requirements, right? And again, we're looking at Regulation 9 here. The operator has to ensure that everyone working in a quarry, everyone working in the quarry, has the competence to do whatever's required of them, or is competent to do it whilst operating under the immediate supervision of someone who is undoubtedly competent both to supervise and do the task correctly. So we know that people have got to be competent. And yet, we're falling into some traps on competence, in my experience. Okay. Case not too long ago, organisation that operates closely with extractive industries and is in aggregates, but again I'm not going to mention names, had engaged a fitter from another organisation, a competitor, a larger competitor, one that my client believed to have very sophisticated, very useful systems and procedures. And so what happened? His competence was taken for granted. It was assumed that he had the competence. Now, when he is then without his right arm after a serious accident in a failure to lock out, the inference is going to be that the competence might not have been there. This should be fairly simple to deal with. All that happens is we should be able to show that he has made some major mistake and that clearly he was competent. And how's competence measured? Combination of qualification, training, experience, instruction, all of those things that come together to provide the necessary competence that's needed. But what's happened is we've never objectively tested his competence. Our eyes off the ball. We assumed he had it because he worked for the competitor. He was a mate of a mate who did a similar job for us. And you can see suddenly that what's happening is we have, and you might think it's remarkable, but it happens a lot. We've taken someone on, and because of where we've got them from and what they do, we have made assumptions as to their competence. You can't do that. You have got to independently establish their competence, even if they come to you as an experienced employee. A few thoughts about training, if I may, because these things have cropped up from time to time as well. How competent is the person who's giving the training? It's all very well to say, well, we've trained people, but if you've trained them with somebody who is simply passing on his mistakes or inexperience, you're not training them very well. Sounds obvious when I say it here, but it happens a lot. So take a step back and ask yourself, look, are the people that we're using internally or externally to train, do they tick the competence boxes? Or are we at risk of perpetuating bad practice? And yes, I have seen that. One-sided training. What do I mean by one-sided training? Countless clients have said to me, we gave him the best training. We got external people in. They're renowned experts. They gave this guy fantastic training. And I've said to them, the HSE inspector is going to judge the quality of that training from what's been received, not what's been given. Think about that. It's not how good you say it is, it's what's actually gone in at the other end. And just because you've given someone training, for heaven's sake, if they keep making mistakes or doing the job properly, that raises questions about the training, the quality of the training that they had. But also possibly, which brings me to the last point, in some cases you may not be able to put in what God's left out. You may never be able to train the bloke to do it properly at all, in which case he's a liability to himself and to your business. You don't know what you're doing, so you don't know what we're doing. This is, I'm afraid, a rather, unfortunately, too repetitive notion with a great many of the organisations that I represent. The senior management, the directors, are simply lacking in understanding of what their responsibilities are. When you hear Simon Taylor speak shortly, you'll hear a little bit more, perhaps, on this. But the point I want to make at this moment in time is that there are still too many senior people who believe that in some way the organisations they represent delegate duty. You never delegate health and safety duty, I'm sure you all know that. What you can delegate is the way in which your health and safety arrangements are managed on a day-to-day basis so that the organisation complies with its duties. Now that's very different. And yet I am finding still boards of directors who are very detached from how health and safety is managed in a business and what the arrangements are. Directors who could not find their way reasonably around a health and safety document. They're not expected to know every single bit of the quarries regulations, ACOP and all of health and safety law. But if they don't know what the responsibilities are, how can they check that anyone's providing them? And it's not always about what's being done by a health and safety team. It's sometimes that the board has appointed one of their number to take overall responsibility, if you like, head up the responsibility for operational health and safety, but the rest of the board don't even know what that guy's doing. And in those circumstances, incredible reliance is placed on him to do his job properly, if you think about it. Incredible reliance. Boards of directors, senior officers of organisations have to engage. Hugh explained to you how Walters did that, and that's quite impressive. There is clear engagement, there's clear understanding. But you've got to ask yourself, is that what we're perceiving here? Now, in my experience broadly of this sector, we're better at that at board level than a lot, but we're still not getting it right. And in a sense, we are still, and I'm afraid this may hit more at the smaller operators than the larger ones, but we're still in the mindset of let's get ourselves the health and safety manager, and then all the problems go away. And if anything goes wrong, then it's his what's it on the line and not ours. And that, I'm afraid, is a how wrong you can be. And you may as well stick, as you've seen here, full guy wanted, NEBOSH dip cert essential. Because broadly, that's what you're acting for. Now, I love this bit. We take health and safety very seriously. The number of clients that I have advised and represented who've not long killed somebody who tell me that is quite remarkable. And it's a rather difficult notion to grasp if you think about it. That's like the guy who's driven along the road, and this is most definitely none of you, mobile phone in hand, watching the world go by, and has mown down several school children at the bus stop, turning round and saying to his lawyer, "I'm a very good driver. I just made a mistake on this occasion." Well, it just won't run. No one will believe that, and they certainly won't believe it in the field of health and safety. I have directors who will frequently say to me, "Alan, I want you to make it absolutely clear in court that this organisation takes health and safety very, very seriously." And once I was in the magistrates' court, a true story, and in the loudest possible whisper, I heard one man on the three-man bench who was sitting in judgment on us saying, "I bet they do now." Think about it. You're bound to have taken it, you're bound to say you're taking it seriously when something goes wrong. I would far rather say we have an excellent health and safety culture. We have very good and effective health and safety arrangements and a record to be proud of, and we've steadily reduced accident rates, both serious and non-serious, consistently over the years, and we intend to reach, Hugh, zero harm. That's what you want to say, because against that background, if something's gone wrong, then guess what? We might even have a defence. He might stop beating me all the time, okay? And that would be very nice. Although at that point, he won't let me come and talk to you anymore. So, when it goes wrong, just quickly, well, we now have this thing called fees for intervention. I'm going to astound you now, and you're not going to like me for it. I am so happy that this has come in. Because before it did, it was the health and safety lawyer that you had to pay to give you grief and make you feel thoroughly miserable and inadequate. Now at least we've got two organisations that can do that. Right? £124 an hour. Roy, you and I know it's a bargain, but these people are probably less convinced. Yes. It rather begs the question, what are we paying for? But I realise you could interpret that in two ways. The reality is, when these guys find material breach, now you get a notice of contravention. It doesn't matter if they're in on a normal inspection visit or they're in investigating. That's probably the very least you're going to get. So nice to avoid that, because it racks up, and it really does. And what's more, because of what we do, it's not always in the remit of the health and safety inspector to zip in, find the problem, zip out straight away. There's more to it than that. So he's going to be there for quite a while, and he's going to be arguably racking up rather a lot of fees for it. So please avoid that. Enforcement action, we know all about that. These guys can, of course, issue enforcement notices against you, improvement and prohibition notices. This is perhaps not the platform for me to say that I think far too many of you take these on the chin without truly stepping back and looking at the implications and genuinely, in some cases, obtaining legal advice on them. I can tell you that the vast majority are technically in order and you would not have a prayer of successfully appealing them, but I'm always surprised at how many don't even seek a legal opinion as to at least the implications, if not the enforceability. So sorry if I exceeded my brief there, gentlemen, but I think it's worth saying. Then, of course, you can end up with a prosecution. I'm not here to talk about fines in other cases. I am not here to rescare you on the subject of corporate homicide and corporate manslaughter. That's not my role today. But what we do know is that they can prosecute organisations, they can prosecute consultants, Section 36 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. They can prosecute directors where the offence of their company has been committed with their either because of their neglect or consent. I remain surprised that prosecutors in health and safety offences do not ask more frequently for the court to consider disqualifying directors where directors have been instrumental in the offence that's been committed, but for some reason they don't seem to do that much. It perhaps brings out the better side in them. They don't want to twist the knife. Truly that is something that can follow. Prosecution can lead to all kinds of penalties. If we're looking at a fatal accident, we're looking, especially with some of you guys, we are looking hundreds of thousands of pounds, if not seven figures. That's one hell of a lot of money. And individuals can be sent to prison, of course, for health and safety offences. Or, heaven forbid, could be indicted for gross negligence manslaughter. So that's the scary bit, but I'm afraid it's something that we all have to live with, and that's why we have to get it right. Reputational and commercial harm, that's obviously a potential problem for you. Hugh, I'm sure, would say, yeah, I mean, you heard him say, I don't want to be contacted by anyone to say that we've had a serious accident on the premises, but also he knows that it is an impediment to getting the next contract. Your health and safety record needs to be sharp. And so it can affect you quite badly, especially when you're pitching for public contracts. And finally, I want to end on the note of the actual cost. It's not just about the fines. I represented a client not too long ago, £750,000 fine in a double fatality upheld by the Court of Appeal. We didn't do a sophisticated calculation, but we did enough of a penning out of the costs that were not insured could not be recovered. So it's not just about the £750,000, which can't be insured off, of course, but it was about all the other costs to the business of having a very senior team assist me over a number of years. And we genuinely believed that the hidden costs of the exercise exceeded the total of the fine. Bear in mind, the combined fine and cost was £750,000. So that's the cost to the business. And again, sorry to keep harking back to Hugh's presentation, but it was very good in that regard. If he has an accident, he's down for days. If he avoids an accident, he isn't, and everything's tickety-boo. The hidden costs are huge, so avoid them, please. Some of the mistakes, and hopefully you'll all go away and think, well, we're not making any of those, but it was nice to hear about them. But if you are, perhaps you might want to do something about it. Okay.
Thank you, Alan, for a very enlightening presentation. I think we've got time for a couple of questions. If anybody would like to ask a question.
I am
free. Are they free, these questions?
They're cheaper than Roy. And and do feel free, because I'm a lawyer, to say, well, when are you going home? Anything, you can always have a word with me. I'm around for the day if you want to just run something past me that you don't want to ask in front of your more intelligent friends and colleagues, then please just have a word.
Thank you, Alan. Could you show your appreciation?
I'm grateful. Thank you.